They told my daughter I was already dead before I'd even finished my coffee. That's the kind of sentence that sounds impossible until you've lived it, and by the end of this story, you're going to understand exactly how a dead man planned his own funeral just to watch the living dig their own graves with their bare hands. My phone rang at 6:40 in the morning, and it shattered a silence I didn't know I'd miss. It was my daughter, Renata. Her voice was shaking, but not with grief. It was vibrating with something colder, something that had been waiting for permission. "Dad," she said, "Grandpa died last night. Massive stroke at the care home." Before I could even open my mouth, the phone was ripped out of her hand, and I heard the oily, self-satisfied voice of my son-in-law, Trent Marsh. He didn't say hello. He never did. "Listen to me, Desmond," he said, dropping the word "Dad" the way he dropped it the day he married my daughter. "The old man is gone. And guess what, he never signed that new trust you kept pushing for. We found the 2010 will. Everything goes to Renata. The house. The land. The accounts. It's all ours. You get nothing. You've got 3 days to pack your bags and get out of my house." I set the phone down on the kitchen table, face up, still on speaker, and I didn't say a single word. I just looked across the table at the man sitting there with a butter knife in his hand. My father, Colonel Elias Whitcomb, 91 years old, a decorated veteran of 2 tours in Vietnam, was buttering his toast like the world hadn't just tried to bury him. He took a slow sip of black coffee. He looked at the phone, where Trent was still laughing at something Renata had whispered. Then he looked at me, and his eyes were clear and sharp as a bayonet. "Is that right?" he said, voice low as gravel. "Well then. Ask the boy what flowers he's planning to order for my funeral. My name is Desmond Whitcomb. I'm 65 years old, and I spent 40 years of my working life as a structural engineer, making sure the towers going up in downtown Atlanta didn't buckle under their own weight. I know what a hairline crack looks like the day before it becomes a headline, the way a building can look perfectly solid right up until the moment it isn't. But the deepest crack I ever missed in my life wasn't in a foundation. It was sitting across from me at every Sunday dinner for 6 years, smiling with a mouth full of my daughter's cooking, telling my father his war stories were fascinating while checking his watch under the table the whole time. If you've ever felt the particular sting of betrayal from the people you raised, hit the like button right now and subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments which city you're watching from tonight. I read every single one of them. Today I'm going to tell you how a man everyone believed was dead sat quietly in the dark and let his family show him exactly who they really were. The morning sun was cutting through the blinds in long gold stripes across the kitchen table. The smell of bacon and grits hung in the air, the smell that used to mean safety in that house. But the voice coming out of that phone was pure poison. "You still there?" Trent barked. "Did the shock give you a heart attack too? Don't die on us yet, we need your signature on the release forms. Willow Bend needs next of kin to release the body to the crematorium. We're going with the economy package, no point spending real money on a shell." My father didn't flinch. He chewed his toast slowly, wearing his reading glasses low on his nose and his favorite gray cardigan, the one with the hole in the left elbow he refused to let anyone patch. He looked at that speakerphone with an expression somewhere between amusement and disgust, like a man watching a dog bark at its own reflection. I forced my voice to break. I'm here, Trent. I can't believe it. He was fine yesterday. We played chess yesterday. He was 91, Trent snapped. He wasn't fine, he was a ticking clock. And honestly, it's a relief. That facility was bleeding us $15,000 a month for a man who just sat there and drooled. I watched my father's hand tighten around the coffee mug. His knuckles were swollen with arthritis, but they were still strong enough to crack a walnut in one squeeze. He had never drooled a day in his life. He'd beaten me at chess 3 days ago and gloated about it for 20 minutes, the same way he'd been gloating over Sunday chess games for decades with 2 or 3 old friends who called him just to argue about the news and swap stories nobody else would understand. Trent didn't know that, because Trent had never once sat down and actually looked at the man whose fortune he was already spending in his head. Then Renata came back on the line, her voice pitched softer now, more careful. It was a performance, and I could hear the calculation underneath it, the way you can hear a generator humming under a nice quiet house. "Dad," she said, "I know this is hard. But Trent's right about the house. The market's hot right now, we should sell while it's hot. We'll get you a nice little place in the suburbs. Less stairs." Less stairs was code. It meant less visibility. It meant tucked away somewhere I couldn't watch what they were doing with my father's name. They wanted the house my father built with his own 2 hands in 1966, back when a black man buying land in that neighborhood got a burning cross on his lawn within the first year, and got it again the second year just to make sure the message stuck. He built that house anyway. He raised me in it. I raised Renata in it. And now they wanted to sell 40 years of blood and mortar to cover Trent's gambling debts and a crypto account that had already gone up in smoke, though I didn't know that part yet. I looked at my father. He raised one eyebrow at me and mimed zipping his lips shut. He wanted me to play the part. "Okay," I whispered into the phone. "Okay, Renata. If that's what the will says." "It is what it says," Trent cut in, sharp and final. "I've got his lawyer on speed dial. We're coming by in an hour with the appraiser. Have your things boxed up. And don't steal anything, everything in that house belongs to the Whitcombmarsh estate now." The line went dead. I stared at the phone until the screen went dark. Then I looked at my father. He finished his toast, wiped the corner of his mouth with a napkin, and said, in a voice as calm as a man discussing the weather, "So. I'm dead. And I'm getting the economy package." I poured myself more coffee. My hands were shaking, but it wasn't fear anymore. It was the kind of rage that sits in your chest like a stove left on. "They called Renata from Willow Bend," I said. "Told her you died in your sleep at 3 in the morning." My father snorted. "Willow Bend," he said, like the words tasted bad. "That place was never golden and it was never a horizon. It was a waiting room for the forgotten." 2 days earlier, Trent had convinced Renata to move my father from his private care suite, the one costing $15,000 a month, to Willow Bend, on the pretext that the private suite had a plumbing issue. In reality, Trent kept billing Renata's trust for the private suite and pocketing the difference, while my father sat in a state ward that smelled like bleach fighting a war it was losing against something much worse. But Trent made a mistake he didn't even know he'd made. He forgot, or he never bothered to learn, that Colonel Elias Whitcomb once carried a wounded lieutenant 11 miles through hostile jungle on a leg that was bleeding through 2 tourniquets. A broken front door alarm and a night nurse asleep on her phone were never going to hold him. "Walked out at midnight," my father said. 3 miles to the gas station. Called you from a payphone I didn't even know still worked. I remembered that call. 2 in the morning, my father's voice steady despite everything, telling me exactly where to find him. I'd smuggled him into the house through the back door, and we were going to go to the police in the morning. But now the situation had changed entirely. Willow Bend must have done its overnight bed check, found my father's bed empty, and rather than admit publicly that they had lost a 91-year-old man in the middle of the night, they had apparently found it easier to attach his name to whoever else had died in that building that same night. "Some poor soul with no family to check the paperwork," my father said quietly, and for a moment his anger softened into something like grief for a stranger he'd never met. "So what do we do?" I asked. "Do we call the police right now? Do we call a lawyer?" My father set down his fork. He wiped his mouth with slow deliberation and looked around that kitchen, every beam he'd carried up on his own shoulder, every brick he'd laid when white contractors wouldn't touch the job. He had just heard his granddaughter and her husband discuss his death like a winning lottery number. "No police," he said. "Not yet. If we tell them I'm alive right now, they'll apologize. They'll say it was a misunderstanding. They'll fake the love again just long enough to find a real chance to finish the job." He stood, walked to the pantry, and pulled back a section of shelving that had looked, for 60 years, like nothing more than canned peaches and flour. Behind it, a small, ventilated, soundproofed room he'd built with his own hands the year the clan was still active 2 counties over. "I'm going under," he said. "Bring my radio. Bring the chessboard." He stepped into the shadow of that room and turned back once. "You've got 3 days, Desmond," he said. 3 days to let them dig their own grave with their own hands. Then he smiled, and it didn't reach his eyes. "On the 3rd day," he said, "I rise." The false door clicked shut, and I pushed the shelf of canned goods back into place, and for the first time in years, I had a mission instead of just a Tuesday. If your gut is already telling you this family had no idea what was about to hit them, you're right, and it only gets heavier from here, so go ahead and hit that like button now before you forget, and subscribe if you haven't already, because the next part is where the real digging starts. I want to be honest with you about something, because a story where everyone is either purely good or purely wicked isn't a true story, it's a cartoon. My father wasn't perfect in all of this, and he'd be the first to tell you so. A few nights later, sitting in that dark little room with the radio humming low, he said something to me I've never forgotten. "Maybe I hid too much of myself from that girl," he said, quiet, almost ashamed. "Maybe if she'd seen me sweat once, really sweat, really scared, really broke, she wouldn't have grown up thinking a man's whole life could be priced out in dollars." I didn't have an answer for him that night. I still don't, not really. I drove to Willow Bend that morning to identify a stranger's body. The lobby smelled like industrial bleach losing a losing battle against urine and boiled cabbage. The tile was chipped. The lights buzzed with a flicker that gave you a headache in under a minute. A director with a coffee stain on his tie and eyes that wouldn't hold still slid a shoebox across his desk toward me, a comb, a half-eaten bag of peppermints, a dog-eared paperback romance novel. My father had dental implants he'd paid $20,000 for. He read only military history and biography. He was bald as an egg and diabetic to the point of never touching a peppermint in his life. None of it was his. I signed the paperwork anyway, letting my hand shake on purpose. In the basement holding room, the air turned cold and smelled of formaldehyde and old rust. Under the sheet on that gurney was a stranger, thin, emaciated, a scruffy white beard on a face that had clearly lived hard and alone for a long time. I grieved for him honestly, right there, hand on the sheet, even while my mind was calculating what I needed to do next. I leaned against the counter, feigning weakness, and glanced at the medical chart hanging beside the bed. It listed a diagnosis of advanced dementia and full-time bedridden care, 3 insulin injections a day. None of it matched my father, who managed his sugar with diet and a single pill, who walked 2 miles every single morning rain or shine. But scrawled in red ink in the margin was a note that told the real story: patient transferred to Ward C, Economy Wing, adjust internal log, do not adjust billing. Trent was billing for the $15,000 suite while paying for the $2,000 ward, and pocketing the rest, or worse, letting the state cover it while he drained my father's real accounts dry. I asked for a glass of water to buy myself a minute alone, and while the director stepped out, I photographed that chart, the shoebox of fake belongings, and the stranger's face, quietly promising him under my breath that I'd see he got a proper burial with his own name on the stone. When the director came back, cup of lukewarm water in hand, he seemed almost relieved to find me still standing, still breathing, still willing to sign whatever he put in front of me. "We can arrange direct transport to the crematorium within 48 hours, he said, already reaching for a fresh form. "No need for a viewing. Most families find it easier that way." I told him I wanted the opposite. Full ceremony. Open casket. No expense spared. His pen paused mid-air. "Sir, with respect, the preservation on a case like this, handled the way it was handled here, it won't hold up well under lighting for a viewing. I'd strongly advise against it." I told him I didn't care what it cost, and I watched the calculation shift behind his eyes from concern to opportunity, the exact moment a nervous man decides greed is easier to live with than honesty. Then I told the director I wanted an open casket service, full ceremony, no expense spared. He looked nervous. He knew an open casket risked exposing the mismatch, but greed always finds a way to talk itself past fear, and he agreed to transfer the body to a funeral home of my choosing. I walked out of that building with photographic evidence on my phone and a fire in my chest that I hadn't felt in 20 years, and for the first time in a long while, I was actually looking forward to a fight. That evening, Trent and Renata arrived with an appraiser named Mr. Henderson, a small man with a laser measuring device clipped to his belt like a holstered weapon. They didn't come to comfort me. They came to count the spoons. Trent walked through my father's living room like a customs officer cataloging contraband, kicking the leg of the velvet Chesterfield sofa where my late wife used to nap on Sunday afternoons, calling it garbage, calling the first edition books on the shelf junk that nobody wanted anymore. He stood inches from the pantry, complaining loudly about the cast-iron skillets my father had cooked in for civil rights leaders 40 years earlier, never once knocking on the wood that hid the very man he was insulting. I sat in my father's old leather armchair and absorbed every word of it, because I knew a reel-to-reel recorder in that panic room was catching all of it, every insult a nail, every threat a line in an indictment nobody had written yet. Renata stood near the door, clutching her purse, and for 1 second, just one, I saw something like shame flicker across her face when Trent kicked that sofa. She looked away before I could be sure. Trent wasn't finished with the house that night. He walked into the dining room and rapped his knuckles against the mahogany table like he was testing a used car. Solid wood, or veneer, he muttered to Henderson, the appraiser. Write it up either way, we'll say solid, it photographs better for the listing. He moved to the grandfather clock in the corner, a German antique gifted to my father by a general he'd served under, a clock that had chimed every single hour of my entire childhood. Trent tapped the glass face with his ring. $5,000, he said. Maybe 6 if we find the right collector. Write that down. He walked past the bookshelf that held my mother's first editions and the encyclopedias my father had bought me piece by piece when I was in the 4th grade so I could learn how bridges stood up. We should knock this wall down, Trent said, gesturing grandly at the room like he was already showing it to a buyer. Open concept. Put a wet bar right there. Nobody wants these dark old rooms anymore. Henderson scribbled everything down without once looking up, the red dot of his laser measure crawling across the walls like a sniper's scope hunting for a price tag instead of a target. I sat in that leather chair and let every word land, because I knew exactly who was listening from behind a wall of canned peaches 12 feet away, and I knew every insult was being fed straight onto a reel of tape that would outlive Trent's whole fortune. Renata stood near the doorway the entire time, arms wrapped around herself, and when Trent kicked the leg of my mother's old Chesterfield sofa a second time, hard enough to leave a scuff, I saw her flinch like she'd been the one struck. The next morning, the lawyer arrived. His name was Mr. Voss, young, slick-haired, a suit too tight in the shoulders, the kind of man who had learned to talk without ever making eye contact with the people whose lives he was rearranging. He read a will aloud in the flattest possible voice, a document claiming that my father, being of sound mind, believed I had failed him as a son and left the entirety of his estate to Renata and Trent. I stood up so fast my chair scraped the floor. My father would never say that, I said, and I meant every word of it, even though I was performing grief on top of real anger, which is a strange and exhausting thing to do at the same time. I demanded to see the signature. Trent shrugged and let me look, smug and certain, already savoring the moment he expected to watch me fold completely. Go ahead, old man, he said. Study it all you want. Ink's dry. I leaned over the page, adjusting my glasses like a man trying to make peace with a fact he couldn't argue with. The ink slanted smooth and confident to the right. But 4 years earlier, arthritis had made it nearly impossible for my father to hold a pen in his right hand, and rather than stop writing altogether, he'd spent 6 painful months teaching himself to write with his left. Every check, every birthday card, every letter he'd signed since then leaned backward, slightly rougher, more deliberate. Whoever forged this signature didn't know that basic fact about the man whose life they were stealing. I said nothing about it out loud. I let my shoulders sag. I let Trent believe he'd won. I negotiated 1 week to grieve properly and organize my father's things, in exchange for a signed waiver promising not to contest the will. Trent, impatient and greedy, jumped at the deal, thinking he'd bought my silence for the cost of 7 days rent-free occupation. He had actually just bought me time, and time was the only thing I needed. The moment their car disappeared down the driveway that evening, laughing about dinner reservations, I knocked on the pantry door. My father stepped out into the kitchen light, took one look at the fake will still sitting on the table, and tore it cleanly in half with hands that weren't shaking at all. "Get the car, Desmond," he said. "We're going to look at the bank." What we found there very nearly broke him. $2 million, gone, bled out over 18 months in small, careful withdrawals labeled home repairs and consulting fees, every single check carrying that same confident, forged, right-leaning signature. The trail led to a crypto exchange, where the money had vanished into something called Solara Futures, a name that meant nothing to either of us except that it represented 40 years of my father's sweat evaporating into an app. My father sat in that chair, staring at the screen, and for a long moment he didn't say anything at all. I have to pause here for a second, because I know some of you watching have lived through exactly this, watching a lifetime of savings disappear because someone you trusted decided your money was theirs to gamble with. If that's you, hit like right now, and let me know in the comments how you found out, because you are absolutely not alone in this. Now let's get back to it. Then he reached for the old landline on the desk. "I'm calling the police," he said. "Tonight. I want him arrested in handcuffs in front of every fancy friend he's got." I put my hand over the receiver. "Pop," I said. "If we take him tonight, he's a victim of bad luck and grief and confusion. If we take him tomorrow, in front of 500 witnesses, standing at a pulpit lying to God about a man he tried to kill, he's a villain for the history books. My father, the same man who once told me a sniper never fires until he sees the whites of their eyes, sat with that for a long, heavy minute. Then he nodded once. "Tomorrow, then," he said. "But I want the heavy cuffs. The ones that hurt a little." That same night, I drove my father across town to a place that doesn't exist on any map you'd find on your phone, a door with no sign, wedged between a barber shop and a boarded-up electronics store, a single blue neon light buzzing behind dusty glass. My father called it the Ember Room. I hadn't been inside it in 20 years, and I'd assumed, like most people my age assume about most things from their youth, that it had closed down long ago. "Legends don't close down, son," my father said, leaning on his cane as he approached the steel door. "They just go underground." He tapped a rhythm against the metal with the brass handle of his cane, 3 taps, a pause, 1 tap, and a slot slid open, revealing a pair of eyes narrowed by decades of suspicion. "We're closed," the voice grunted. "Tell him the colonel is awake," my father said quietly. The eyes went wide. The slot slammed shut, and half a second later I heard bolts sliding back on the other side. Inside, the air was thick with cigar smoke, aged bourbon, and the low mournful sound of a saxophone drifting from somewhere in the back. Sitting in a circular booth in the far corner were 3 people who looked like they'd been carved out of granite by history itself and never quite finished softening. On the left sat retired Judge Corinne Voss, 80 years old, a woman who had argued civil rights cases in front of judges who didn't want to hear her name, wearing a suit pressed sharp enough to cut paper. On the right sat retired Police Captain Reuben Marsh, the first black precinct captain the city had ever had, hands the size of dinner plates resting flat on the table. And in the middle, smoking a thin unlit cigar, sat Dr. Aldous Fenn, the county's former chief medical examiner, a man who had performed more autopsies than anyone else in the state's history and had the quiet, unshakable calm of someone who had made peace with death a long time ago. When my father stepped into the light, the room didn't gasp. It simply went still, the way a held breath goes still. All 3 of them stood at once, not in shock, but in something closer to reverence. "I told you death would need a warrant to take Elias Whitcomb," Judge Voss said, and the 2 of them embraced like soldiers who had survived something together, because in a way, they had. Captain Marsh pulled out a chair. "Sit down, Elias. Somebody get this man a real drink. We told them everything, the fake death, the panic room, the forged will, the $2 million burned down to nothing in a crypto account. Dr. Fenn shook his head slowly at the mention of the John Doe being cremated under my father's name. That man deserves his own name when he goes to meet his maker, he said, and there was no performance in it at all, just plain conviction. I'll make a call tonight. He'll be transferred to the county morgue where he belongs, and I'll see to it personally that he gets a chaplain and a headstone with his real name on it. No loose ends, Elias. Not on my watch. Captain Marsh leaned forward, his voice dropping low. What's the play here? Because if you two walk into that cathedral tomorrow, and this Trent character feels cornered men do stupid, dangerous things. My father didn't hesitate. I want 4 of your best in the choir loft, he said. Men who know how to stay invisible until the moment they're needed. Marsh nodded, already reaching for his phone. Judge Voss offered to handle the district attorney's office directly, to make sure a warrant was ready and waiting the second the doors opened. And Dr. Fenn, with a grim little smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, offered to make sure the casket itself would raise no red flags before the service, sealed, heavy, and entirely under our control. There was a long stretch that night where the planning gave way to something softer, old stories, the kind that only surface when 4 people who trust each other completely finally sit down together after years apart. Judge Voss reminded my father of the summer she'd sued the city over redlining in this very neighborhood and won, and how my father had shown up at the courthouse steps every single day of that trial just to make sure the cameras had at least one familiar face to look at besides hers. Captain Marsh told a story about the night he arrested a sitting city councilman for drunk driving, and my father had bailed the arrest report out of a filing cabinet before anyone with more power could make it disappear. Dr. Fenn, quieter than the other 2, mostly just listened and smoked, occasionally adding a dry, understated line that landed harder than anything shouted. I sat at the edge of that booth, 65 years old myself, and felt like a boy again, watching my father belong somewhere completely, in a way I'd never once seen him belong at any of Trent's dinner parties or country club fundraisers. Before we left, Judge Voss took my father's hand across the table. You should have called us the second that boy moved you into that facility, she said, gentle but firm, the way old friends are allowed to scold each other. My father looked down at the table for a moment, something almost sheepish crossing his face. Pride, Corinne, he admitted. Didn't want any of you seeing me weak. Didn't want to be the old man who needed rescuing. Judge Voss squeezed his hand harder. Pride nearly got you cremated, Elias, she said, and the whole booth laughed, the kind of laugh that only comes after real fear has finally passed. Dr. Fenn gripped my arm at the door on our way out. Tell your father something for me, he said. Tell him the dinosaurs aren't extinct. They just learned to wait. I promised I would, and I did, and my father laughed for the first time in 3 days. I should tell you about the night before the funeral, because it's the part of this story that surprised even me. I'd gone back to the house near midnight to check on things, and I found Trent alone in the driveway, sitting on the hood of his Porsche in the dark, not celebrating, not laughing, just sitting there with his head in his hands. He didn't hear me come out. I stood by the door for a minute, watching him, and for the first time since all of this started, he didn't look like a predator. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in days, jumping at every set of headlights that passed on the street. He noticed me eventually and straightened up fast, wiping his face like I hadn't seen anything. What do you want, old man, he said, but there was no real heat in it. I asked him, plainly, why he looked like he'd seen a ghost already, a full day before he was supposed to see one. And for about 30 seconds, something in him cracked open. He told me, not an excuse, not a justification, just a fact laid bare, that he'd grown up in a house where his own father measured his worth in report cards and bank statements and nothing else, where love came with a price tag attached from the time he was 7 years old. He said he'd sworn he'd never be that broke, humiliated kid again, and somewhere along the way, in trying to outrun that, he'd borrowed $2 million from men in Chicago who didn't send late notices. He said, quiet, almost human, I know what I did to your father was wrong. I knew it while I was doing it. I just couldn't see another door out of the room I was in. Then, just as fast as it had opened, the door in him slammed shut again. He straightened his jacket, and the sneer came back like a mask sliding into place. Doesn't matter now, he said. Tomorrow it's all mine anyway. He got up and walked inside without looking back, and I stood alone in that driveway for a long time, understanding for the first time that a monster and a frightened, cornered animal can sometimes be the exact same man, and that understanding that doesn't excuse a single thing he did. The next evening, I met my daughter alone at a coffee shop where I used to buy her hot chocolate after ballet recitals, back when her biggest dream was to become a judge and save the world. She showed up in cashmere, brittle underneath all that polish, dark circles under her eyes that no concealer could quite hide. I pushed her, gently at first, and then not so gently, and the truth finally spilled out in tears across the table. Trent hadn't just gambled and lost, he'd borrowed $2 million from men who didn't send late notices. They sent photographs, of her walking to her car, of him at the gym, with a deadline attached and a threat that needed no explanation. She believed, or had convinced herself to believe, that selling my father's legacy was the only way to keep her husband breathing. I told her the truth costs more than she understood. You put a price on his breath, I said, quiet, final. $2 million. That's what your grandfather's life was worth to you. Her hands were shaking around her coffee cup. I didn't want him to die, Dad, she said. I just needed the money more than I let myself think about what that meant. I looked at her, really looked, the way you look at your child when you finally understand you can't protect them from their own choices anymore. You had options, Renata, I said. You could have come to me. You could have come to your grandfather. We have dealt with dangerous men before in this family, and we came out the other side of it. You could have gone to the police, gone to the FBI, gone to anyone. Instead you chose to lie, chose to fake a death certificate, chose to let an old man rot in a state ward hoping he'd die fast enough to solve your problem before the deadline came due. She begged me to sign the waiver and disappear quietly, to let it all go for her sake, her voice cracking on every third word. I left a $20 bill on the table for her coffee and walked out into the street, and for the first time in my life, I mourned two people at the exact same moment, my father, who wasn't actually gone, and my daughter, who very much was. The funeral was held at Grace Cathedral, a building so vast it makes you feel like a whisper the second you walk through the doors. 500 people packed those pews, bankers in sharkskin suits, developers checking their watches, society reporters angling for a good photo, almost none of whom had ever actually met my father in his life. Trent stood at the pulpit in a suit too shiny for real grief and delivered a eulogy built entirely out of lies, claiming that in his final days, my father had gripped his hand and called him, the son I never had, personally handing him the keys to the family's entire future. My father, for the record, had never once called Trent anything gentler than, the peacock, and usually not even that kindly. Trent's eulogy ran long, longer than it needed to, because he was clearly enjoying every second of the room's attention. He told the crowd that in his final days, my father had worried aloud that the next generation wasn't ready to carry the family forward, that he'd feared his hard work would be squandered by people who didn't understand sacrifice. He painted himself as the reluctant heir, humbled by the weight of a legacy he never asked for, and I watched grown men in the front row nod along solemnly, moved by a story that had never once actually happened. Renata sat beside me with her head down, shoulders shaking, and I genuinely couldn't tell anymore whether it was grief or guilt driving the tears, and I suspect, looking back, that she couldn't fully tell either. The $50,000 mahogany casket sat at the front of that church, sealed tight, heavy with sandbags and one small Bluetooth speaker taped carefully into the satin pillow, right where a head should have rested. I sat in the front pew with my phone hidden beneath the fold of my black coat, the call already connected, waiting. When Trent reached the height of his performance, declaring that he accepted the torch my father had supposedly passed to him, I pressed the button. First came a single sound, low and strange, a throat clearing, amplified by centuries of stone acoustics into something that made 300 people shift uneasily in their seats. Then came the knock, 3 slow, deliberate, unmistakable thuds from inside a sealed wooden box that was supposed to contain nothing but a dead man and $50,000 of grief theater. Then a voice rolled out of that casket, gravel and iron and absolutely unmistakable. "You're a liar, Trent Marsh. If chills just ran down your arms reading that the way they ran down mine living it, do me a favor and smash that like button right now. This next part is the moment everything Trent built came crashing down, and you don't want to miss a second of it." The room came apart at the seams. A woman in the third row fainted outright. Cameras began flashing wildly from the back of the church. Trent staggered backward from the pulpit, insisting it was a recording, a prank, some kind of elaborate hoax rigged up by a grieving old fool, right up until the heavy oak doors at the back of the cathedral slammed open and a shaft of morning light poured down the center aisle, framing a wheelchair and the man sitting bolt upright inside it. My father sat in that chair in his full dress uniform, medals catching the light across his chest, spine as straight as a flagpole, flanked by three old friends who looked like they'd stepped directly out of a black and white photograph: retired Judge Corinne Voss, retired Police Captain Reuben Marsh, and Dr. Aldous Fenn, the county's former chief medical examiner, each of them standing with their arms folded and their faces set like stone. I walked to the back of the church, took the handles of that wheelchair myself, and began pushing my father down the aisle he had built, quite literally, with the tax dollars and sweat of a lifetime nobody in that room had ever bothered to learn about. Nobody breathed. My father took the microphone with a hand that didn't shake at all. "Good morning," he said, calm as a man opening a church service. "My apologies for arriving late to my own funeral. I was in a meeting. With my lawyers. And with the district attorney." He turned his chair, slow and deliberate, to face Trent directly. "You told this church I was scared. Weak. That I handed you my life's work with my own two hands on my deathbed." He leaned forward, just slightly. "Look at me, son. Do I look scared to you?" He listed the crimes off on his fingers, one by one, as calm as a man reading a grocery list out loud: kidnapping, wire fraud, forged documents, and a note in a medical chart showing that his insulin had been quietly withheld, a decision that could have put a 91-year-old heart into a coma inside of a single night. "You didn't use a gun, Trent," my father said. "You used a pen. But you tried to kill me just the same, and I want everyone in this room to hear that fact plainly." A murmur rippled through the crowd, disbelief giving way to something closer to horror as they began to understand they hadn't been mourning a death at all, they'd been used as props in someone's theft. Judge Voss stepped forward from beside my father's wheelchair, her voice carrying easily to the back pews without any need for a microphone. "The district attorney's office has been briefed on all of this since last night," she said. "Every document, every transfer, every falsified medical chart. This isn't a family dispute anymore, ladies and gentlemen. This is a criminal case." Several of the bankers in the front row began quietly gathering their coats. Uniformed officers stepped through the side doors near the choir loft. Trent, finally cornered with nowhere left to run, did the one thing a certain kind of man always does when the wall's close in: he turned on the only person left standing beside him. He screamed that it had been Renata's idea from the very beginning, that she was the one who drafted the fake will, that she told him her own grandfather was better off dead. My daughter stood alone in that pew while her husband tried to feed her to the wolves to buy himself even 30 more seconds of freedom, and I watched something in her face break for good, right there in front of 500 strangers and God. The cuffs went on. He was still shouting her name as they dragged him out through those oak doors, and the sound of it echoed off the stone ceiling long after he was gone. Someone near the back began to clap, hesitant at first, and then it spread through the pews the way applause does at a funeral it was never supposed to happen at, half the room still not entirely sure whether they just witnessed a tragedy or a miracle. A reporter from the business section was already on her phone with an editor, describing the scene in a voice too loud for a church. I stayed on that altar a moment longer than I needed to, looking out at 500 strangers who had come to watch a man they'd never met get buried under a pile of somebody else's lies. Renata hadn't moved from the pew. She sat there alone in the space Trent had left behind, the isolation around her almost physical, the other guests instinctively pulling their coats and their children a little further away, as if whatever had just happened to her husband might be contagious. I looked at my father in his wheelchair, and he gave me the smallest nod, the same nod he used to give me on job sites 40 years ago right before we tested whether a beam could hold the weight we'd promised it could. If you're still with me here, that's the moment this story could have ended, the truth exposed, the villain in handcuffs, the crowd stunned into silence. But the real ending happened later, quieter, at the police station, for hours after the ambulance for the woman who'd fainted had already come and gone, when Renata finally walked out through those steel doors looking like a woman who'd been taken apart piece by piece and put back together slightly wrong. Her makeup had run in long gray streaks. Her hair had come loose from whatever careful style she'd worn that morning. She saw us waiting in those hard plastic chairs, and she stopped walking, like she couldn't decide whether we were there to save her or to finish what the church had started. My father didn't raise his voice at her. He didn't need to. He told her, gently but without a single ounce of softness underneath it, that what she'd done wasn't love, it was commerce, that she had priced her own grandfather's life at exactly $2 million and made her peace with the number. I've watched men do worse for less, he said. Doesn't make it easier to hear from your own blood. Then he handed her an envelope. Not forgiveness. An eviction notice from every property the family owned, and papers for a brand new trust. Not a family trust this time, but a community one, every dollar redirected into small business loans and college scholarships for kids from the same poor South Side streets my father had clawed his own way out of. Renata herself would receive exactly one thing from that point forward, a monthly stipend equal to minimum wage, on the single condition that she worked 40 hours a week at a shelter or a soup kitchen. Miss a single hour, and the money stopped that month, no exceptions, no appeals. Her hands shook so badly reading it that the pages made a dry, rattling sound in the quiet of that waiting room. You're making me homeless, she whispered, staring at the papers, her voice barely above a breath. I'm making you an adult, my father said, and told me it was time to take him home. She called out once behind us as we walked toward the doors, our names both at once, and neither of us turned around, though I felt every step of that walk in my chest for days afterward. We drove back in silence, the city lights sliding past the windows, and for a long while neither of us said anything at all. Finally, somewhere past the old textile mill on 4th, my father spoke, quiet and rough. We loved her the wrong way, Desmond, he said. I grew up sleeping on a dirt floor, hungry more nights than not. When I finally had money, I swore no child of mine would ever know that feeling. So I gave her everything, and I never once let her see the sweat that paid for it. He looked out the window at the passing streetlights. We wrapped her in cotton wool and called it love. We built her a life with no rocks in the road, and then we acted surprised when she never learned how to walk on rocks. I didn't argue with him, because I'd done the exact same thing in my own smaller ways, the tutor when she failed a class, the new car after she wrecked the first one, looking the other way when Trent's charm didn't quite match the substance underneath it. We can't fix the past, my father said. But it's not dark yet, son. There's still time to fix what comes next. That night, back at the house, my father fed the old will and every fraudulent document into a paper shredder in his study, one page at a time, watching 50 years of estate planning turn into confetti. The old plan is dead, he said, dusting off his hands. Time to write a new one. This time in stone, not sand. He opened a drawer and pulled out a fresh leather binder his old friend Judge Voss had helped him draft that same week, not a family trust this time, but something bigger, aimed outward instead of inward. We sat together at that desk past midnight, signing pages, building something neither of us fully understood the size of yet, and for the first time since the phone rang at 6:40 that morning 3 days earlier, I slept without worrying about the roof falling in. A year passed. Trent is serving 15 years now at a state facility 2 hours outside the city, and from what I understand through Captain Marsh's old contacts, prison has been a very lonely place for a man who spent his whole life believing charm was a currency that worked everywhere, including on cellmates who don't watch cable news. The syndicate he owed money to never got a dime, and I've made my peace with never knowing exactly how that particular debt eventually settled itself. My father is 92 now. The doctors who once gave him a matter of weeks seem almost personally offended that he's still alive to prove them wrong every single morning at breakfast. He plays chess twice a week with Captain Marsh, and he still wins more often than he loses, though I suspect the captain lets him take at least one game out of every 4 out of pure respect. The Community Trust, the one we signed that night in his study, gave out its first round of scholarships 8 months ago. 10 kids from the same streets my father grew up hungry on are starting college this fall on a full ride, and 3 small businesses have opened their doors with interest-free loans that will never show up on anyone's dividend statement, because that was never the point. And Renata, my daughter, never did come back to the house. She sold what jewelry Trent hadn't already pawned, moved into a small walk-up apartment in a part of town Trent would have been afraid to drive through after dark, and took a real job as a social worker, the kind of work she used to say she wanted to do back when she was 17 and still believed the world could be fixed with enough effort and honesty. It hasn't been easy for her, from what little I hear. She works long hours for very little money, and some weeks she calls me just to talk, and some weeks she doesn't call at all, and I've learned not to chase her on those weeks, because chasing her was part of what taught her she'd never have to stand still on her own 2 feet. Last month, an envelope arrived at the house with no return address, just a postmark from the east side of the city. Inside was a check for $75 and a note in handwriting that wasn't the polished lawyer's script she used to sign contracts with. It was hurried, a little uneven, the handwriting of a woman who works 50 hours a week and writes her notes standing up. She'd fixed a leak under her own kitchen sink with a wrench instead of calling a plumber, and she wrote that she thought her grandfather would be proud of that, more than anything else she could have sent him. I read that note out loud to my father on the porch that evening, and he didn't say anything for a long moment. He just nodded, slow, and looked out at the oak trees losing their leaves in the last of the light, and I understood that some repairs take longer than a single season, and that this one, at least, had finally started. If you've stayed with me this long, you already know that a story like this doesn't end with a courtroom or a mansion. It ends with 2 old men on a porch in the evening light, and a check for 75 honest dollars that means more than anything Trent ever tried to steal in his life. Before you go, hit subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss the next one, and tell me down in the comments, would you have forgiven Renata as fast as the Colonel did, or was the hard road the only road that could have actually saved her? We treat the elderly like they've already faded, easy to overlook, easy to underestimate. They are, more often than we admit, the architects of the very ground we're standing on. And if you ever try to bury the truth, you had better make absolutely certain it's actually dead. This is Desmond Whitcomb, signing off. Call your parents tonight.